Kenneth Supreme McGriff, a notorious American drug lord and the leader of the infamous Supreme Team, a powerful criminal organization that dominated the streets of South Jamaica, Queens in the 1980s during the crack cocaine epidemic. Known for his ruthless leadership, McGriff's empire expanded through drug trafficking, violence, and intimidation. His influence stretched beyond the drug trade, reaching into the world of hip-hop, where he formed connections with key figures in the music industry. Despite his eventual downfall and life imprisonment, McGriff's legacy continues to cast a shadow over New York's criminal history. Kenneth Supreme McGriff was born in 1960 in South Jamaica, Queens, New York. His story is one that intertwines with the rise of the crack cocaine epidemic in the 1980s, a time when urban areas across America were devastated by crime, addiction, and violence. McGriff, who would later become the leader of one of the most infamous drug organizations in New York, the Supreme Team, had a significant role in shaping the criminal underworld during this period. If you're enjoying this video so far, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. The early years. McGriff was raised in a time when opportunities for young African-American men in urban neighborhoods were limited. His early life, like many of his contemporaries, was marked by the socioeconomic challenges that plagued South Jamaica. Poverty, unemployment, and crime were rampant. However, it wasn't until McGriff reached his teenage years that he would begin to understand the opportunities the drug trade could offer, particularly in a community that had long been neglected by governmental institutions. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, New York City was undergoing profound changes. The rise of hip-hop culture was paralleled by the explosion of the drug trade, with the introduction of crack cocaine creating a lucrative yet devastating black market economy. For McGriff and other young men in South Jamaica, drugs became a means of survival and wealth. The formation of the Supreme Team. McGriff founded the Supreme Team in the early 1980s, and it quickly became one of the most powerful and feared drug organizations in New York. The Supreme Team operated primarily out of the Baisley Park Houses, a public housing project in South Jamaica, which served as the epicenter of their criminal enterprise. What made the Supreme Team stand out from other drug crews was McGriff's military-style organization. The crew was structured with clear hierarchies, strict rules, and an efficient chain of command. McGriff, or Supreme as he was known, was at the top, serving as the head of the organization. Under him were lieutenants, street soldiers, and lookouts. This level of discipline and organization made the Supreme Team not just a local gang, but a powerful criminal syndicate. McGriff's leadership was also rooted in his charisma and ability to inspire loyalty among his followers. He had a reputation for being strategic, calm under pressure, and ruthless when necessary. This combination of traits allowed him to rise quickly within the drug trade, earning the respect of his peers and the fear of his enemies. The crack epidemic and the Supreme Team's rise to power. The early 1980s saw the explosion of crack cocaine in urban centers across America, and New York was no exception. Crack was cheap, addictive, and highly profitable, making it the perfect drug for dealers looking to maximize their earnings. For the Supreme Team, the timing was perfect. With McGriff's leadership and the crew's disciplined approach to the business, they capitalized on the crack epidemic, quickly becoming one of the largest drug distribution networks in Queens. At its height, the Supreme Team was making millions of dollars in drug sales each year. They controlled entire housing projects, turning them into fortresses where drugs were sold openly, and law enforcement was kept at bay through fear and intimidation. The crew's reputation for violence was well-earned, as they were involved in countless shootings, murders, and assaults. For McGriff, maintaining control of the drug trade meant using violence as a tool to eliminate rivals and keep his soldiers in line. Violence and intimidation. One of the key factors that contributed to the Supreme Team's dominance in the drug trade was their use of violence. McGriff understood that in the world of street-level drug dealing, power was often determined by who was willing to be the most brutal. As a result, the Supreme Team was involved in numerous violent confrontations with rival crews, particularly over territory. McGriff's enforcer, Gerald Prince Miller, played a critical role in carrying out much of the crew's violent activities. Miller, who was McGriff's nephew, was feared for his ruthlessness. Under McGriff's orders, Miller and other members of the crew engaged in shootings, beatings, and even executions to maintain control over their territory and to send a message to competitors. The violence also extended to law enforcement in the community. The Supreme Team was known for their brazen attacks on police officers and for intimidating witnesses who might testify against them. This created a climate of fear in South Jamaica, where few people were willing to stand up to the gang. As a result, law enforcement faced significant challenges in bringing members of the Supreme Team to justice. Law enforcement's response. By the mid-1980s, the Supreme Team's power had become too large for law enforcement to ignore. The violence and drug dealing associated with the crew had attracted the attention of local and federal authorities, who began to make serious efforts to dismantle the organization. However, taking down the Supreme Team was no easy task. The crew was well organized, with members who were loyal and willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their leader. Additionally, McGriff had insulated himself from much of the day-to-day operations of the drug trade, making it difficult for law enforcement to directly tie him to any specific crimes. It wasn't until a series of high-profile murders and violent incidents that law enforcement was able to start making progress against the crew. In particular, the murder of a New York Police Department officer named Edward Byrne in 1988, which was allegedly ordered by the Supreme Team, galvanized efforts to bring down the gang. Byrne had been sitting in his patrol car outside a witness's home when he was ambushed and shot to death by members of the crew. The murder shocked the city and led to a massive crackdown on the drug trade in Queens. Federal authorities began using new tactics to dismantle the Supreme Team, including wiretaps, surveillance, and the use of informants. These efforts ultimately paid off when, in 1989, McGriff and several high-ranking members of the crew were indicted on federal charges, including drug trafficking, racketeering, and murder. The fall of the Supreme Team and McGriff's imprisonment. By 1989, the federal government's case against Kenneth "Supreme" McGriff and the Supreme Team was strong. After years of building evidence, largely through the use of wiretaps, informants, and undercover operations, law enforcement was finally able to penetrate the inner workings of the organization. The FBI and DEA, in conjunction with local law enforcement, launched a massive takedown of the Supreme Team, which culminated in the arrest of McGriff and several of his top lieutenants. The charges against McGriff and the Supreme Team members were extensive, ranging from drug trafficking to murder. The government's case highlighted the sheer scope of the Supreme Team's operations and the level of violence they used to maintain control. Among the most damning evidence presented was McGriff's alleged involvement in the murder of a police officer, which added immense pressure on the legal proceedings. McGriff was eventually convicted on drug-related charges and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. His imprisonment marked the end of an era for the Supreme Team. Without their leader, the organization began to unravel. Many of McGriff's lieutenants were also incarcerated or killed in the years that followed, leaving the Supreme Team in disarray. However, McGriff's imprisonment did not completely eliminate his influence. From behind bars, he remained a powerful figure in the criminal underworld. He maintained contact with many of his former associates and continued to direct activities from his prison cell. Additionally, McGriff's legend grew in the years following his arrest, as stories of his exploits and dominance over the drug trade continued to circulate. The 1990s, McGriff's incarceration and shifting power dynamics. During the 1990s, as McGriff sat in prison, the landscape of the drug trade in New York began to change. The crack epidemic that had fueled the rise of the Supreme Team started to wane, as law enforcement crackdowns, community activism, and changing market dynamics reduced the demand for crack cocaine. New crews and organizations rose to prominence, filling the power vacuum left by the dismantling of the Supreme Team and other major drug organizations. But while McGriff's direct influence on the drug trade may have diminished, his legacy loomed large. Many younger drug dealers and gang leaders idolized McGriff, seeing him as a symbol of power and success. In particular, his leadership style, his ability to command respect, instill fear, and maintain discipline, became a model for aspiring criminal leaders. Throughout his imprisonment, McGriff reportedly continued to manage his criminal empire, albeit in a more limited capacity. Inmates who served time with him described McGriff as a larger-than-life figure within the prison system, respected by other prisoners and feared by some. His ability to exert control from behind bars was a testament to the power and influence he had built over the years. The connection to hip-hop culture. While McGriff was serving time, an unexpected development began to occur in the world outside. The rise of hip-hop culture, particularly gangsta rap, which often glorified the lifestyles of drug dealers, hustlers, and street criminals. For many in the hip-hop community, McGriff's story was emblematic of the struggles and triumphs of the streets. In the 1990s, Queens, New York became home to several iconic hip-hop artists, many of whom had personal ties to the streets and to figures like McGriff. The likes of Nas, Mobb Deep, and LL Cool J all emerged from the same neighborhoods that had once been dominated by the Supreme Team. Their music reflected the harsh realities of life in Queens, and McGriff's story served as a backdrop for much of the imagery in their lyrics. One of the most prominent connections between McGriff and hip-hop came through his association with Murder Inc., a record label founded by Irv Gotti. Murder Inc. was home to popular artists such as Ja Rule and Ashanti, and McGriff's ties to the label raised eyebrows among law enforcement. Gotti had grown up in the same neighborhood as McGriff, and the two had reportedly been close since childhood. Law enforcement authorities suspected that McGriff had used his connection to Murder Inc. to launder drug money and to maintain his influence in the criminal world. These suspicions would eventually play a key role in McGriff's later legal troubles. McGriff's legal troubles in the 2000s. By the early 2000s, McGriff had been released from prison, but he found himself once again under intense scrutiny from law enforcement. Despite his imprisonment, authorities believed that McGriff had never fully abandoned his criminal activities. In particular, they suspected that he had continued to be involved in drug trafficking and had expanded his reach into other illegal enterprises. One of the most significant developments in McGriff's legal troubles during this time was his alleged involvement in a series of murders. The most high-profile of these was the murder of rapper E-Moneybags, Eric Smith, in 2001. E-Moneybags had been a close associate of McGriff's rival, Tupac Shakur, and it was believed that McGriff had ordered the hit in retaliation for previous disputes. The murder of E-Moneybags became a focal point in the government's case against McGriff. In 2005, McGriff was indicted on charges of murder for hire, drug trafficking, and racketeering. The government alleged that McGriff had orchestrated multiple killings, including the murder of E-Moneybags. In order to protect his criminal enterprise and to settle old scores. The indictment also included charges related to McGriff's involvement in the drug trade and his ties to Murder, Inc. The trial that followed was one of the most high-profile criminal cases of the time, as it brought together the worlds of hip-hop, organized crime, and law enforcement. Prosecutors painted a picture of McGriff as a ruthless crime boss who had used his connections in the music industry to further his criminal empire. McGriff's defense, however, argued that he had been unfairly targeted by law enforcement and that the government's case was built on unreliable witnesses and circumstantial evidence. The conviction and sentencing. In 2007, after a lengthy trial, McGriff was convicted on federal charges of murder for hire, drug trafficking, and racketeering. The conviction was a major victory for law enforcement, as it not only brought down McGriff but also highlighted the intersection of organized crime and the music industry. McGriff was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, effectively ending his reign as a major figure in the criminal underworld. McGriff's conviction was the culmination of decades of investigation and legal battles. For law enforcement, it was the closing chapter in the long saga of the Supreme Team and their influence on the New York streets. For the communities that had been devastated by the crack epidemic and the violence that came with it, McGriff's downfall represented a measure of justice for the years of suffering they had endured. Kenneth McGriff also cannot be separated from the larger narrative of the American criminal justice system. The war on drugs, which disproportionately targeted Black and brown communities, was in full swing during McGriff's reign. Harsh sentencing laws, mandatory minimums, and aggressive policing tactics often served to perpetuate cycles of poverty and incarceration rather than addressing the root causes of crime. In this way, McGriff's downfall was not just the result of his actions, but a reflection of a system designed to trap people like him in a revolving door of crime and punishment. Yet there's another side to McGriff's legacy, a quieter, more personal side that isn't always captured in the headlines or the courtroom drama. Throughout his life, McGriff showed moments of generosity and care for his community. Some saw him as a protector, someone who gave back to the neighborhood in ways that the government and institutions had failed to do. But as with all figures in power, the line between benefactor and exploiter becomes blurred. The legacy of Kenneth Supreme McGriff and the Supreme Team. The story of Kenneth Supreme McGriff and the Supreme Team is one that is deeply intertwined with the history of New York City, the rise of crack cocaine, and the evolution of the criminal underworld. McGriff's ability to build and maintain a powerful criminal organization in the face of constant law enforcement pressure was a testament to his leadership skills and strategic thinking. However, McGriff's legacy is also one of violence, devastation, and loss. The Supreme Team's operations left a lasting impact on South Jamaica and other parts of Queens, as families and communities were torn apart by addiction, crime, and violence. The crack epidemic, in particular, had long-lasting consequences, as it decimated entire neighborhoods and created cycles of poverty and despair that continue to affect those areas to this day. For many, McGriff's story serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of the drug trade and the false allure of power and wealth. His rise to prominence may have been fueled by the pursuit of success and control, but in the end, it led to his downfall and the destruction of countless lives. A symbol of power and ruthlessness. For many, McGriff's legacy is one of fear, ruthlessness, and raw power. He was able to command loyalty and respect from his crew while instilling fear in his enemies. His leadership of the Supreme Team was not just about control over the drug trade, it was about embodying a persona that was larger than life, a street legend who lived and died by the code of the streets. At the height of his reign, McGriff was a symbol of the street-level entrepreneur, someone who took advantage of the chaos in urban America to carve out a space of dominance. His strategic mind and organizational skills allowed him to turn the Supreme Team into a multi-million-dollar empire. But with that came violence, destruction, and suffering for the communities they operated in. The people of South Jamaica, Queens, many of whom were innocent bystanders, bore the brunt of this devastation. Entire families were torn apart by the drug trade, with countless young lives destroyed by addiction, gang violence, and the criminal justice system. McGriff, despite his achievements, left behind a legacy stained by bloodshed and the wreckage of a community that continues to recover to this day. The end of an era. Kenneth, Supreme McGriff and the Supreme Team, is one that reflects the broader social and economic issues that have plagued America's inner cities for decades. His rise to power and eventual downfall are symbolic of the cycles of poverty, crime, and violence that continue to affect communities like Southside Jamaica, Queens. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos on Underworld icons.